Okay, thank you all for joining us for this session of the Eyes Artist Talks. So this is the fourth edition of the Eyes Artist Talks at Paris Photo, and we're very pleased to be welcoming another amazing lineup of guests this afternoon. I'm sure many of you recognize my guest right now, and I am just going to introduce him extremely briefly before really handing over the floor. Introducing somebody that has over 50 years of an incredible career is an impossible task in the short amount of time that we have. But what I will say is that Joel Meyerowitz is one of the major figures of photography in the last 50 years, and he's really known particularly for two specific genres of photography. The street photography in New York, and also his incredible pioneering work in color on the landscape. And today, Joel is going to be talking about his new book, Provincetown, that's just been published by Aperture. And I think this body of work is a really fascinating combination of all of Joel's work. And I will start off the session and hand over to you. And please join me in welcoming Joel Meyerowitz.
Thank you. Thank you. Did you want to ask a question, or shall I just dive into this?
Well, let me just start by asking you. So the book is entitled Provincetown, and could you just tell us, for an audience that is from all over the world, what is Provincetown, and what specifically was Provincetown at the time when you were taking these photographs in the late 70s and 1980s?
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you for this opening question. Provincetown is a town at the very end of Cape Cod, which is near Boston. It's a long sandbar that goes 100 kilometers out into the sea. And it's the town that the Pilgrims first touched down on when they landed in America. And they couldn't exist there because it was so demanding. It was a winter time. And they made it across the bay to Plymouth, which became famous as the first site in America for pilgrims to land. But Provincetown today is a different kind of place. It's Land's End. It's the place where people go when they need to get away from their lives in the city, or if they feel oppressed in some way, socially or sexually or mentally. They go to this place because it's known to be a place of great tolerance and acceptance. And when I started going there in the middle 1970s, it was still an artist town and a fisherman's town. Famous American writers like Norman Mailer lived there. Painters like Robert Motherwell lived there. Historically, it was the home for those kinds of people in the arts and the theater and painting to get away from New York or Boston or big cities. But in the 70s, it was a refuge for gay people who were coming out or struggling with conditions. Their sexuality in the cities was becoming demanding, and the AIDS crisis was beginning. And Provincetown was this place where they could come and feel welcome and at peace. And as a new visitor there myself, I had the sense that we were on the edge of a big change, that things were going to happen, because you see it in the most extreme places first, and then it builds. And so I started making photographs in the most ordinary way, just portraits of people. And up until this time, I had not been a portrait photographer. As a street photographer, the pictures I make are generally spontaneous. I don't ask permission. People move through the frame just as I move through the crowds. But I didn't really know what a portrait was like until I was working in Provincetown with an 8 by 10 inch wooden camera on a tripod. And suddenly the invisibility I had in the streets of New York was no longer the same. Everyone saw me with a 6-foot-tall camera and wanted to know why I was using an old wooden camera. And that gave me an opportunity to actually encounter people, to come in and see the gesture that you're making right now, like this, and the way you're looking at me. Suddenly that became an inspiration or a seduction, or I was drawn to it for some visceral reason that I couldn't explain. And so I began to make portraits just to see how it was to confront somebody and how close I could get to them and how intimate I could be with a total stranger. And I think what's at the core of this little talk for me today, and by the way, I only have 15 minutes with you, 10 minutes to do this talk, and then 5 minutes for questions. But if a question comes up, just holler it out, and we'll have a conversation rather than me giving just a talk. So when I found myself standing in front of people, having said to them, I need to make your portrait, and then the person would say, okay, I think it was the big camera that seduced them, not my personality. I would then really look at them as if they had just given me access to their innermost lives, to their secret in a way. And I would also notice little things, little details. Could you go back one? I would just notice a little detail from the street photographer side of me, and I would think how important that was, and I would make sure that that detail, the gesture, would be the thing that was inviting me to make this picture and drawing me in some way. Okay, next. For instance, this woman, who's a fisherwoman in Provincetown, she had recently taken her eye out with a hook. And all of us who knew her were very tender and emotional about that. But when I said, Sam, I want to make a portrait of you, she was so nervous to do it that I noticed she was digging her knife into her finger. That little detail, in a way, gives me the sense that I'm seeing the real essence of her fear or her shyness or her anxiety, whatever it is. There are always telling details in a portrait, whether it's the face of somebody or their action. Throughout this work, there's 100 portraits in here. And I should say that I didn't know I was going to publish this book. The work was in my archives, and Michael Famighetti, who is the art director of the magazine, Aperture Magazine, had called a friend of his, who was my archive director, and was talking about a project. And she said, oh, Joel has hundreds of portraits of people that might suit this article of yours. And he took a look at the pictures for the book, for the magazine, and said, oh, we have to do a book. So there's 100 photographs in here. And in order for me to put the photographs into some kind of an order that felt good to me, I broke it up into 6 sections. So there's men, there's women, there's couples, there's gay couples, there are mothers and daughters, and there's a group of photographs that are odalisques of women and men lying down on the beach. And I came across them and felt that something in their gesture was important to me. Well, I'm only going to show you a small selection today, but this is indicative of mothers and daughters, for example. And this is mothers and daughters, too. It's a way of trying to give the range of the work, which was general, some kind of specificity, so that there was an organizing principle. You know, in a way, I tried to behave like a street photographer. I carried my 8x10 camera full out on its legs on my shoulder, the way I would carry a Leica on my shoulder. And I walked through town, or I walked on the beaches. Wherever I went, that camera came with me. And I would see people, two young women who were waiting tables in the local restaurant. And it was the break in between shifts, I guess, between meals. And they were just standing and talking. And as I came to them, something about the black and white of their uniforms in a colored space like Provincetown was, something that spoke to me. In fact, a few times, black and white played an interesting part in the making of the photograph. Working with a view camera requires time. It's not like a street photograph where you can shoot at 1,000th of a second. This is a photograph that took almost 3 seconds for the exposure. So I felt like I was back in time, like in the 19th century, making photographs in which people had to really compose themselves. They had to be in their bodies and in their lives in a way that allowed them to give something of their secret or their mystery to me. And I think if you're trying to be a portrait photographer, if you're trying to understand that, you have to be able to think that you have the capacity to draw out of somebody in one frame something of their hidden mystery. And if you wait long enough, or if you converse with them in such a way that you hold a string, almost an invisible string between you and that other human being, you might be able to communicate with them and draw something special out of them. Because when you put that sheet of film in the camera, you step aside, and it's only the subject and the camera. And in a way, the photographer becomes the voyeur. You watch that person live in front of your instrument, breathe and be uncomfortable or settle down or open up or show their shyness. These are parts of our mystery and our personality and our spirit. So in some ways, I think it's possible to photograph human spirit if you just find the line that you can draw between yourself and the person you choose to connect to. Does that make any sense to any of you who are thinking about portraiture? It's a game, but it's a really human game. Now, at some point, I put an ad in the local paper and I said, Joel Meyerowitz, no, I said, remarkable people. If you are remarkable or know someone who is, if you have scars or freckles or stories or anything that makes you remarkable, Joel Meyerowitz wants to make you a portrait, come to this place. Hundreds of the most ordinary people came to see me, and each one said, I'm remarkable. And they were, because we all are remarkable. We all are special to ourselves. We are unique in that way. And so when they would come, they would say, well, what should we do? How should we pose? And my answer was always, just make yourself comfortable. And it always amazed me what people do to make themselves comfortable. I couldn't tell them to wrap themselves around each other that way. But the fact that they did it was part of the magic for me as the observer, watching them tangle themselves up. Because I really want no hand in it. I don't want to direct anybody. I want to maintain some kind of a freedom and freshness between me and the other. Because I think we all search for ourselves in the other. Some small component of our, whatever is at our core, somehow vibrates in harmony with another when you feel something special connecting you. And that's part of where I went to find portraiture. Again, make yourself comfortable. I guess it's comfortable. So here, this beautiful woman came up off the beach onto my deck. And before I made the photograph, she decided to put some lipstick on. And then I noticed that her lip separated into this little space. And for me, that flaw became the content in a way. Could you go back one? The other one. I mean, so here's a whole photograph with the light raking in off the side, and she has really stepped up to it and looking burningly into the camera lens. And then I see this, and I think the 8x10 view camera is capable of making a print wall size like this. So the smallest detail becomes important. And a little thing like that, a little flaw like that, is perfect. Next. So I was at a local circus that came through town for 3 days. And this kid fascinated me, seeing him on the bed of nails. And I said, is it painful to lie on the bed of nails? He says, it's much easier to lie on the bed of nails than to lie on one nail. Philosophy. But what really interested me was the steely violence of those points and the delicacy of the hair on his ribs, the little glitter of light on those blonde hairs seemed to me like that was the vulnerable part of this man. So my little cottage was right on the water, and one morning I came out of the house and I went to go for a swim, and this woman was sitting right at the foot of my stairs. You know, she had been with a friend at the house nearby. And as soon as I saw her, I said, I need to make a portrait of you. And she said, I'm fine, I'm just sitting here. But what I saw, besides her and her slender dancer's physicality, was the way the water and the sunlight was writing the information around her body. And photographically, that to me was the interesting thing, the thing that made it like a street photograph. Something was happening besides the portrait and the person. So sometimes it's little things like that. This is a friend, and it was his 50th birthday, and a lot of us were there to surprise him. And he came from Boston to his home on this pond, and when he saw us all there, of course, he was shocked. And I said, Rick, I want to make your 50th birthday photograph, as a present for you. And he said, well, what should I do? Should I get undressed? We'll go for a swim, and then you make a picture? I said, no, just go into the pond in your business clothes, because I only knew him as a swimming partner. And so he went in and stood and made that, and it seemed ridiculous and kind of special to me. So in Provincetown, there are a lot of parties and surprises. And I was crossing someone's private property, and I see this guy. He's walking the other way, and I call out and say, hey, you, I want to make a portrait of you. And between the two of us was this little corn crop. And here's a guy dressed as corn. His name, honest to God, his name was Joel Cobb. Corn on the... Anyway, I mean, what is the likelihood of me seeing a guy dressed as a corn cob next to a stand of corn? That to me is street photography. And if you don't have your camera with you, when something like that happens, you say, oh, I wish I had, I should have brought, where is? But it happened. So, there was a long series of, after all, when you go to the beach, people are lying down. So I had a lot of opportunities to make odalisques, you know, a la Matisse. But she's just stunned me that she had changed bathing suits midsummer or whatever and had this leftover patch of her cut-off jeans or whatever it was. And, you know, sure, I see the humor in it and the vulnerability in it, but I also see that flesh in sunlight is a remarkable substance that we all are endowed with. And to see the way the sunlight had been, you know, molesting her. Next. She was my kid's babysitter one summer, and she's 16 years old here, and you know, interesting portrait. Next. Okay, that's it. That's all I'm going to show. We have some time if there's a question or anything. Would you like to moderate that? Or, yeah?
Certainly. I'm sure we have many questions. We only have about another 5 minutes, so who would like to ask Joel a question?
Holler it out. Hi. I don't hear the question.
I believe the question was it easier for you to take pictures while you were younger? And I would like to say this is his question, not mine. Or now that you've lost all your hair?
That's really an important question that goes unexamined, I think. When I was younger working on the streets, and I was my 35-year-old self, let's say, it was easy to move in and out of a crowd and come up to women and mothers and children, and people would accept my innocence, you know, because I was like them. But when you're 80 years old and you're trying to photograph somebody with their child, you know, they view you as a pedophile or, you know, a leering old guy. So it was easier in those days to, and the streets were easier too. It wasn't like today with cell phones in everybody's hand and everyone aware of their image. Back in the 60s and 70s, people weren't thinking about being famous for being famous or being on the internet and or becoming a meme or something like that. It was just life. And you could make photographs in an easy and comfortable way without people jumping on you because they want to hold on to their rights to their image. People in those days didn't think that they were worth photographing. So they would always look around to see if there was somebody behind them that me or Gary Winogrand or Todd Papageorge or Lee Friedlander were interested in. But it is more difficult now. And I have to remember that I'm not that 35-year-old guy, that I'm me now and I look this way. And how does that play when working in an open social environment? Very interesting question. No one's asked that yet. And you can't ask it again because he asked it. Can you hear?
Okay. The question was, the details that you highlighted in those portraits, the woman sticking the knife into her thumb or the lips maybe, were you aware of those while you made the picture, or were these things that you discovered after the fact when looking at the image?
No, that's the point. While standing, stand up for a second. Come on. Come on, show. While standing in front of somebody and talking to them about our engagement in this moment, I would begin to notice these things. And then, at a certain moment, I have to say to them, you have to stand still here now. I'm going to pull the dark slide. I'm going to put the holder in and pull the dark slide out, and then I'm going to step aside. And then there's always a minute of conversation as I keep them focused on looking into the camera. So they're not looking off sides at me over here, they're looking in the camera. And it's in that 30 seconds to a minute that I really see all of the details. I'm taking it in. And that's what I consider intimacy. I become aware of everything that they are presenting. And I see the sudden, the pressure of that knife into her finger, or the way someone's hand is around her partner's body and is clutching his arm because she's uncomfortable, but he's not. So those little tensions are in play, and I'm the witness of that. And when it reaches what I would call the high moment, the crescendo of action, I sense that they have calmed down enough to let themselves open up and give themselves to the camera. When I sense that, I open the shutter. You know, and these are long exposures. Usually it's like a half a second is the fast one. So it goes a half a second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. You could live and die in that moment, or the picture can be completely obliterated in that moment. So it's filled with a kind of tension and excitement at the same time. Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm afraid that is all that we have time for, but the good news is that Joel is going to be signing copies of the book at the Aperture booth just at the bottom of the stairs in 5 minutes. So for those of you that do still have questions, you can go and find him there. And thank you, Joel, so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody.